Well, welcome, first of all, and thank you very much for the possibility to speak and the invitation. I will speak about the biological origins of violence and aggression. There has been a recent array of research recently, and I will discuss a number of trends and challenges for the social sciences. In recent years, there has been an increasing body of evidence that has focused on the biological roots of violence and criminal behavior. And these studies have explained violence as a biological predisposition that is caused by neurobiological and genetic factors rather than by social, situational, or environmental factors, which has been the predominant paradigm within the social sciences, psychology, and so on for a long time. It is crucial that these new types of understanding violence have also profound implications for the prevention of violence. Prevention from such a biologically oriented perspective will in the future possibly involve the identification of high-risk individuals through the long-term monitoring of the bioprofile of individual citizens or groups of citizens. Such monitoring may, among a range of diagnostic tools, such as brain scans or more conventional forms of psychological assessment, also involve forms of genetic testing. Now, in this presentation, I will first introduce briefly some of the genetic and neurobiological factors that have now been associated with violence, and then I will discuss the potential applications of this biological term with regard to the prediction and prevention of violence. And I will zoom in here on the three domains: the context of reproduction, the context of childhood and adolescence, and also in dealing with severe criminal offenders. Finally, I will discuss the implications of these developments for the social sciences. And I have to say that I do not discuss these issues with a region-specific focus. I think that is something which can be done in discussion, but I think first of all these are issues which are of importance and relevancy beyond any form of region. Well, let's start with a brief overview of the biological roots of violence. And there is now more than 100 studies that indicate that violent behavior contains an element of heritability. And these include many twin studies and many adoption studies. And there's estimates from meta-reviews that assume that the level of heritability lies between 40% and 60%, which is a very vague estimate and which can mean many things, obviously. Yes. So, since the 1990s, these findings have resulted increasingly in attempts to identify specific gene variants or SNPs that can be associated with aggression and forms of extreme antisocial behavior. And there were several candidate genes that have been identified. Approximately 50% of 185 existing studies have reported positive findings. However, a recent meta-analysis has shown that not a single gene variant can be associated with aggression at the level of 5% of statistical significance or below. This indicates, which is well known, that as in other complex behavioral conditions, behavioral disease conditions, the contribution of any single gene is very small, and it is the combination of large numbers of gene variants that interact with each other and that potentially increase the risk of aggressive behavior, aside to a plethora of other factors, of course. Aside to the impact of individual genes, there's now a broad range of biological factors that are associated with violence. These include hormonal factors and neurotransmitters such as high level of testosterone and a low level of serotonin, evidence from brain imaging and neurology, and as the picture on the left here shows, reduced functioning and structural impairments of several brain regions are now associated and seen as potential causes for aggressive behavior or severe forms of violence. But there's also other factors such as prenatal and perinatal influences, such as malnutrition, alcohol misuse during pregnancy or in the childhood or adolescence, as well as nicotine and drug consumption. Well, There's good reason, obviously, to be skeptical to many of these claims. And with regard to brain scans in particular, there has been various forms of criticism, especially with regard to methodological validity due to small sample sizes. Violence, moreover, remains deeply shaped by social and situational forces. And I don't say any more to this because we all are aware of this. Let me now, this second part, continue with the potential applications of the biological term with regard to the prediction and prevention of violence. Let's first of all have a look at processes of reproduction and reproductive decision-making, and forms of reproductive selection in particular. Selection through abortion, admittedly, it sounds first of all like a very unlikely scenario, but think again. If you speak about pregnancies that are caused by multiple murderers or through rape of extremely violent individuals, and if theories and evidence regarding the genetic and biological origins of violence really become more consistent and more widespread, the idea of selective abortion is not so abstruse as it may first sound. But from a more technical perspective, it is obviously extremely unlikely because of the genetic indicators are simply too unreliable. On the other hand, however, I would briefly refer to the contrast case of schizophrenia, and there have now been, in the context of an experimental study, genetic testing for a specific subtype of schizophrenia, and this has been performed on human patients, and it has resulted also in a number of abortions, which indicates that there is an opening up process of prenatal diagnostic possibilities away from unapproved abnormalities and monogenetic disorders to a broad range of conditions. Another case, another scenario refers to the prevention of pregnancy before conception. And in the literature, it has been mentioned this is a likely scenario, but it would be based on the multi-level screening of individuals. Adrian Raine, who is one of the key figures in supporting this form of research and who is also involved in the ethical debates, has introduced the following scenario. He said that people with a life history of extreme violence and criminality are screened for a variety of biological and social risk factors. These include evidence from brain scans, genetic testing, psychological assessment, the evaluation of a criminal family history, as well as assessment of the social and parenting skills of potential parents. On the basis of these tests, it is then, or it can then be determined whether a screened couple should have a baby or not. In severe cases, pregnancy may be prohibited, very similar to the reproductive restrictions of people with mental retardations, which has been practiced for a long time and which is still practiced in several societies. It is clear here lies a huge potential for forms of social exclusion, for stigmatization and discrimination. Let's now turn to the potential applications regarding the prediction and prevention of violence that have been associated in the context of childhood and adolescence. Diagnostic tools that allow for the prediction of a predisposition of violence have now been associated with the following means of prevention and intervention. For instance, preventative medical treatments, forms of psychosocial therapy, training and stress reduction and conflict management, but also maybe even compulsory classes for parenting skills in very high-risk cases, and also obviously education on the impact of risky forms of behavior, malnutrition, substance abuse, alcohol, nicotine, and so on. These interventions may potentially have enabling and beneficial effects, but it is clear here lies also a huge potential for stigmatization and discrimination. Another issue deals with the testing for a biological predisposition to violence among severe criminal offenders. For example, people who have committed a murder and whose bioprofile indicates a predisposition to psychopathy or to sociopathy that may result in a potential replication of severe forms of violence and criminality. In the literature, the following application scenarios have been mentioned. Preventative forms of imprisonment as the most controversial forms, but also forms of preventative biosocial treatment and the application of specific legal procedures, in particular with issues regarding to culpability and responsibility. Let's now briefly discuss some of the implications of these potential applications for the social sciences and issues of discrimination and social exclusion. I think a first complex of question refers in particular to changes in discourse and perceptions of violent individuals and groups of individuals. The first question is exploratory: which forms of research and evidence are emerging with regard to the identification of a biological predisposition to violence and criminality? And how do these forms of research and related applications change existing understandings of the origins, the causes, and prevention of violence? And in which ways do these changing understandings influence discourses on and perceptions of violent individuals and groups? A second issue concerns emerging forms of discrimination and social exclusion. In which ways does the availability of biological tests for violence result in new forms of social exclusion and discrimination, mobbing and stigma, new types of social pressures and requests for conformity, as well as in redefinitions of ideas and discourses of normalcy and abnormality? Finally, what changes in values and attitudes can be observed with regard to people who have committed or are likely to commit severe forms of violence? As regards to the different domains in which discrimination or forms of stigmatization may emerge, based on the discussions, it has become clear it can occur already in the context of the prenatal context, in the female womb, at school, at work, in partnerships, in family. With regard to injuries, I mean, these are all well-established issues, but I just mentioned them and I summarized them. A very final issue I would like to refer to is that these emerging forms of research into the biological origins or roots of violence can also have a link with existing stereotypes and prejudices. And there is, and there have been also speculative links with ethnicity, and this is already represented and reflected in media discourse. In this article from the Associated Press, I think, a scholar from, I think, Pennsylvania State University, Roberts, she interpreted this article as a part of a wave of recent studies arguing that blacks and Latinos are genetically predisposed to violence and abhorrent behavior. So we see here a link with existing forms of social prejudices, also with the history of racism, and the inscription of these older ways of thinking in a new context. And we see that this kind of research can also reinforce imagined boundaries between groups, map upon older forms of identity politics, and also be reinvigorated in the context of contemporary political oppositions. So we see there is a potential for conflict, including violent conflict, based on the ways in which these forms of representations are adopted within public discourse, within political debates and interpersonal interaction processes. I would like to end with this, and I would like to say thank you for Margaret Sleebom-Faulkner, my colleagues at the Center for Bionetworking, Sui Yang and Ole Döring. I have profited a lot from debates with them, as well as a number of geneticists in China and Germany, and also Fred Duby. Okay, thank you.